will never understand what the freedom seekers' lives were like. And she went back 13 times. I liken it to if your hand is in the mouth of an alligator, and that alligator is the institution of enslavement, and one is able to extricate the hand from the mouth of the alligator unscathed, and then you go back and put it in and out 13 times, put it in, pull it out, pull it in, and 13 times. Who does that? That's a great question. The ones I really focused on were the snakes and the gators. I went to Snake and Gator University down there.
Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Dr. Edda Fields-Black. Edda is professor of history and director of the Dietrich College Humanities Center at Carnegie Mellon University. She won the 2025 Pulitzer Prize in History for her book Combee, Harriet Tubman, the Combee River Raid, and Black Freedom During the Civil War. She joins me today to talk about that book. Dr. Edda Fields-Black, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So I read that you grew up in Miami and you grew up in a neighborhood surrounded by lots of extended family. Were there any aspects to your upbringing that helped shape your later professional interests as a historian?
Yes, I grew up, my mother's aunts and uncles lived on the same 2 blocks as us. So our house and our grandmother's house faced each other. The backs of the houses faced each other. I had an aunt and uncle just, down the street and across the street. My mother is a historian and an archivist, and she would hire my sister and I. We were about 8. I remember being about 8, and give us a list of questions on a legal pad, mind you, and a tape recorder with a cassette tape, and send us to her aunts and uncles' houses. And our job was to turn on the tape recorder and ask the questions that Mom had written down and record our uncles and aunts, really giving an oral history, right? We were recording oral histories at 8 years old. And after a while, after a couple, times, I don't know how many years of doing this, I had my own questions. So I had the questions that Mom wrote, but then I developed my own questions to ask my aunts and uncles. And this is how one of the ways that we earned pocket money in our house. And so I also, in hindsight, know that it played a role in me becoming a historian today.
Wow, that's a really fascinating answer. That's great. You had a chance to visit Sierra Leone as part of your studies when you were a student, and I found a quote where you said, "I almost did not come back." Could you share a little of what made that experience so important to you?
Okay. That is true. I almost did not return on that first trip. I spoke a little bit of my mother's family. They are from the Bahamas. My great-grandparents came to Miami from the Bahamas, maternal great-grandparents. My paternal grandparents migrated to Miami from Charleston and then from Green Pond, South Carolina. And so they were Gullah Geechee. I am Gullah Geechee on my dad's side, part of the diaspora. And when I was in college, I started reading, thanks to one of my professors at Emory, about Gullah Geechee language and culture. And then I wrote a grant at Emory to a grant to fund study abroad for the summer. And this was during the 90s. This was during the time when you had these wonderful exchanges between Gullah Geechee people and people in Sierra Leone. And I mean, even President Joseph Momo, who was president of Sierra Leone at the time, came to St. Helena, South Carolina. And these were all very well publicized. So when I arrive in Freetown, Sierra Leone, the question I was often asked, and I'm not just talking about at the university, I'm not talking about people who were sort of in the know, in the intelligentsia. I'm talking about the cab drivers would ask you, "Are you from South Carolina? Are you
Is that
Gula?"
right?
And then they would say, "Welcome home."
Wow.
And I think, it takes me back to Maya Angelou's book, All God's Children Need Traveling Shoes, where she talks about being in the marketplace in Ghana and a woman mistaking her for her family member. And the woman just has a, very emotional reaction when she realizes that Maya Angelou is not her family member, that she's African American. And I think many African Americans want that welcome home, right? We want to go to the continent and be recognized. And I felt like I had that in Sierra Leone, and I wanted it, it was very special to me.
Wow. That's a really interesting answer. Thank you. Uh, I'd like to ask you now to take us back to the early 19th century, to the American Atlantic coast in Maryland, and describe a little of the environment into which a baby girl named Araminta Ross was born.
That's a great question. When you say environment, do you mean the physical environment or the economic environment?
I guess more the physical and social conditions of
Okay.
where she was born.
Okay. So the Maryland Eastern Shore um, was a region of coastal rivers, um, coastal rivers that were different than South Carolina, coastal rivers that one could see through the water. Um, there were differences in the tides being more shallow in the Maryland Eastern Shore. There were differences in many of the animal species that one would find in the Maryland Eastern Shore, like muskrats. Um, One would not find, and there's a wonderful story of Harriet Tubman, um, as a young child being forced to work outdoors and to check muskrat traps. And there are no alligators in the Maryland Eastern Shores. There were in South Carolina. But there were also some similarities. There were tree species, right, that were similar. And so I'm thinking of tupelo trees and cypress trees. That there's a band that goes, along the East Coast that includes both North Maryland and South Carolina. When we think about the Maryland, Virginia area, these are some of the first lands that are cleared in the US. And so the land in that region had been planted by the time Tubman is born in 1822, had been planted for hundreds of years, right? And planted to crops, first tobacco primarily, that were very hard on the soil. They really stripped the soil bare quickly. And so by the time Tubman's born in 1822, there's not the agriculture, and agriculture on large plantations is really not what dominates the economy of that region. The economy is more diverse. And the diversity of the economy is in large part because the land won't support um, the staple crop of the past. And so we see industries, there is some planting, but on small farms of things like wheat. Um, we also see timber playing a very important role. And because we're on the coast, certainly uh, boats, boatmen and people who are transporting things by water are also a very important part of the economy. So, in many ways, this also brought a lot of economic insecurity and a lot more bankruptcy and other kinds of economic problems among the enslavers. And of course, when enslavers have financial problems, then enslaved people have financial problems because they're often sold to solve the enslavers' financial problems. And so there was a lot less security for enslaved families on the Maryland Eastern Shore, including Harriet's, right? And we see that when her sisters, um, Lena and Soph, her older sisters, are sold away from the family and separated from their young children. And I don't think that Tubman and her family they never got over that. And I don't know how I don't think in general that enslaved families did. That was a very difficult thing for them. And I believe they looked for their sisters and their daughters for the rest of their lives. And so we also see Tubman and her brothers were to be sold when they first decided to try to run away together. And then it didn't work out, and they go back, and then Tubman runs away by herself, and she's successful. So the sale and the constant sale and the threat of sale was very much a part of the environment in the Maryland Eastern Shore, in large part because of the environment, the physical environment, because of the economy. It all worked hand in hand. I will also say that the farms were relatively small, and I say this coming from a South Carolina vantage point. The farms were relatively small. There were many more enslavers, planters, farmers who lived in pretty close proximity to enslaved people. It meant that often people could not marry on the same plantation. They could not, or they chose not to. And so we see with Harriet Tubman's parents had an abroad marriage. They were held in bondage by two different people and lived for some of their married life on two different plantations. Um, you also had a free community, that a free Black community that lived in fairly close proximity to the enslaved community. And so we see that Harriet Tubman marries John Tubman, who was a free man. So the dynamics of the Maryland Eastern Shore, of the environment in the Maryland Eastern Shore, are quite different from the South Carolina Low Country.
And is it correct to say that Maryland's proximity to states where African Americans were able to live freely, that allowed Harriet Tubman an opportunity to escape, which in comparison to, say, someone who was held in bondage in South Carolina would have many hundreds of miles more they would have to traverse to get to freedom compared to where she was in Maryland?
Yes, yes. So in Maryland, freedom was relatively close. And as I mentioned, there was also a free Black community and free Black people who were part of it. Was, the communities were connected. And so people had this understanding of what freedom was and of where it was. And I think some people like Harriet Tubman realized how to get there, and that there were people who would help. And, the distance, as you mentioned, is quite different. And I'm not saying that I'm going to sign up to walk from the Maryland Eastern Shore to Philadelphia. It's especially not in the wintertime, right? Especially not at night. Yeah, I'm not doing it. But it could be done, right? And one who was very courageous could imagine and envision themselves doing it. I believe, and someone may prove me wrong, that when you get into the Deep South and you get into, say, South Carolina and Georgia, where free states are so very far away, um, and a free community is even far away, is not an integral part of, right? The communities are not connected. Um, that freedom becomes harder to imagine. And certainly getting to freedom is much harder to do. Now, that said, there's new work happening about kind of maroon communities in places like South Carolina that, this is new work that's coming out now. So I think we'll find out more about that.
You started to bring up character. You used the word courageous. You say a little about her character. She was courageous enough not just to do this long journey and escape to freedom, but she was one of the very few who turned around and went back again.
Yeah. And she went back 13 times. Um, I liken it to if one okay, if your hand is in the mouth of an alligator, and that alligator is the institution of enslavement, and one is able to extricate your hand from the mouth of the alligator unscathed, and then you go back and put it in and out 13 times, put it in, pull it out, pull it in, and 13 times. Who does that? I mean, it's just unfathomable. If you're able to get out, you're out. At least that's how we would think about it today, right? But back then, there were people who, there were people who liberated themselves from slavery and then went on to assist others. Now, and there were certainly other people who went back into the land of bondage or back into the alligator's mouth, right? Um, and came back with other people who had still been in bondage. We haven't found evidence of anyone doing it as many times as Harriet Tubman and liberating as many people as Harriet Tubman. And on top of that, giving detailed instructions to and in those 13 trips, she frees about 70 people. And she gave detailed instructions to other people, and about 70 people used her instructions and achieved freedom. They liberated themselves. So, you know, in both senses, she's risking her life, right? And certainly in going back into the Maryland Eastern Shore and going back into the region, the area, and sometimes the very plantation on which she was held in bondage, she risked her freedom. Um, and she would have rather died, I believe, than to go back and be re-enslaved.
Yeah, she had a purpose and was driven to helping others, I think.
Yes,
So,
a selflessness.
yeah. Uh, as a historian, what are the difficulties associated with trying to identify people who were enslaved in, say, 19th or 18th centuries. In most cases, these people were illiterate, so it was difficult for them to leave records of who they were. So from your perspective in trying to learn about the lives of these people, how do you go about doing that?
Yes, there are many difficulties. The U.S. Civil War pension files are the first federal record in which enslaved and formerly enslaved people are given last names. Okay, it's the first time that African Americans' last names are written down and recognized. And that was for the 200,000 Black men, roughly, who enlisted in the U.S. Army. For the other 3.8 million people, Black people who lived in this country at the end of the Civil War, it's really the 1870 census. And I think it's hard for us to just even get our brains around the fact that Black people didn't have last names before the 1870 census. So what that means is that on plantations where people are held in bondage, they are recorded as property, and they're recorded by first name only. So it's then impossible to identify who's who, because you could have had multiple people with the same first name, right, on the same plantation, or on different plantations. How do you know who's who? What I wanted to do in Combee is to tell the story of the Combee River Raid from the perspectives of the people who were engaged in it. And almost all of those people were illiterate, right? Harriet Tubman, the people who were freed, the men who fought in the raid, I would say 98% of them were illiterate. And that 98% of them, they didn't have, okay. I get excited because as a historian and even as a descendant, it blows my mind, right? How do you find people when all you know is their first name? It's impossible. But what the pension files show is that actually we did have last names, right? Our ancestors had last names in the slave quarters. They just were not recognized by anybody else. And so one of the first things that men do when they're applying for a pension is they have to give the history of their name. They have to give, because often, usually, the name under which they're enlisted, that last name is the name of the person who held them in bondage. But that is often not the name they had chosen for themselves. And so when they come back to apply for a pension, they come under a different name. So they have to explain themselves, right? Who held you in bondage and where, and how did you choose this name, and whose name did you choose? So what that means, they also then testify about the names of their family members. Okay. Sometimes going back 2 or 3 generations. I was able to go back 4 generations sometimes. So what this means is now we have the names, and now we have the family grouping. So I then went back to the slaveholders' records and the records in which they had recorded their properties, their wills, estate records, bills of sale, mortgages, marriage settlements. And I was able to identify the families, the family groupings. They still had first names, but I knew the name of the enslaver, I knew the plantation, and I knew the family members So to be able to go back to the enslavers' records for that plantation and find that family grouping. And often I'm able to trace them back through multiple transactions, multiple sales. People were handed down to different family members, people were given away as gifts, and it's all recorded. And I'm able to trace them in large part because of the pension files. And then these other kinds of records. Once I know the names and the family names, then I can trace them in other kinds of records.
Where did you physically sit working with these documents? Where did you have to go to discover them and go through them all?
Interesting. When I started the archival research for Combee, I was in South Carolina at the South Carolina Historical Society, the South Caroliniana, and the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. So I was in Charleston, I was in Columbia. I did go down to Georgia Historical Society as well. Those were the main repositories for the planter families. As I branched out and started looking at the how do I say this? The planters' papers, as I started trying to identify the slave transactions, most of those records are digitized, right? Most of those records are available online on something like Family Search. The one or two collections that are not digitized are at the State Archives in Columbia, Department of Archives and History. So I had a couple of places. Either I was in the archives, and once I was in the archives and I had digitized the records I need, then I'm in my office at home or in my office here in Carnegie Mellon. And then the same for the digitized records. The other piece is I actually started writing Combee during COVID, and I thought I had finished my archival work. Ha! As I started trying to write the story, right, there was so much more that I needed to paint the picture, to fill in, who are these people and what was their life like, so that I could contrast the enslavers and the enslaved. So on both sides, I had gaps and I couldn't get to the archives. And so then again, corresponding with the archivists. Thank you very much, archivists. And sometimes in a wider pool, because it's amazing where some of these documents and collections are located. They're not all in the Low Country. And then the archivists are sending me digitized material, which I'm in my office at home or I'm in my office at Carnegie Mellon, and I'm poring over my, especially I prefer to be in my office at CMU because I have a big screen and I can blow up the cursive handwriting when I couldn't read it, which was too often. Oh, goodness.
That that all sounds like very exciting research, and you were able to put this all together over years of doing research. So it's very impressive.
Thank you.
Could I ask you about physical, like fieldwork trips or physical trips to Maryland and to South Carolina to see these places with your own eyes and get a sense of place from actually being there? Could you share a little of how that played a role in doing this research and writing the book?
It was really important to me. Um, my goal, my primary goal, I think, in that regard was to put the reader in the rice fields when the raid took place. A secondary goal was I had read, the biographies of Harriet Tubman and their depiction of the raid. And what I read is that South Carolina, coastal South Carolina, and the Maryland Eastern Shore were the same. The environment was so similar that Harriet Tubman could just take what she knew from Maryland and map it onto South Carolina. And because I know coastal South Carolina so well, I knew that wasn't correct. That was not correct. So that was another part of what I wanted to do. I wanted to paint that contrast, and I wanted to show that it wasn't to me, this is actually a higher order. That what Tubman knew was how to read the environment, no matter what the environment was. You know, she could have plopped down on the moon and she would have been able to survive. And to lead people who were desperate and starving and sometimes ill and incapacitated through this frozen wilderness, right? And then she could come down to this environment that was full of snakes and alligators and water you couldn't see through. And she could do the same thing, but in a very different environment. And I wanted people to understand, to try, because we'll never understand what the freedom seekers' lives were like, you know, what they were like before the raid, and how to really ponder how they must have felt that morning when they're out there hoeing rice at 4 a.m. and they can't even see the long-handled hoe in their hand or the rice plants that they're hoeing, but they can start to feel the vibrations, smell the smoke, then hear the whistle of these, they call them Lincoln's gunboats, coming up the river, coming from Union-occupied Beaufort. They knew it was freedom. Even before they saw it, they knew it was freedom and they knew it was coming for them. You know, I wanted us to be able to imagine what they felt like when they dropped them hoes and ran to the boat. So for me, that meant, and for my career, I have spent, I would say, 35 years in the rice fields. I started when I was 2. But I mean, physically in the rice fields with my boots on and my fatigues, on both sides of the Atlantic. And I knew I had to do it again or continue to do it so that I could get the reader to experience those rice fields in my writing, and to be able to recreate the raid. And so I have a lot of wonderful friends and colleagues in coastal South Carolina. Um, and I was leading a team, and members of that team were, the president and CEO of a research center that was on the Combee. And one of the plantations that is part of that research center was destroyed by the raid. So then I developed friendships with people who knew the Combee planters, right? The people who currently own the Combee plantations. So I pretty quickly got myself ensconced on the Combee. And I was, as I said, writing after COVID. I made these connections before COVID. And then as soon as we were able to travel, I went to the Combee. And I was in residence for 18 months. 10 days out of every month for 18 months, I was on the Combee River and on one of the Combee plantations. Um, I hiked. I'm a big hiker. So for 18 months, which is really 2 growing seasons, I hiked the rice fields, I hiked the riverbanks. I saw the vegetation change, grow and die, and then grow up again. I saw the critters. I saw their eggs. I saw them being born. I saw them, you know, running after their mothers and then running away. And the ones I really focused on were the snakes and the gators. I went to Snake and Gator University down there. I also, I have a lot of friends and members of the team that I mentioned, um, research group, who are scientists, all kinds of wildlife specialists, biologists. And so we teamed up and, wildlife photographers, you name it, uh, with different sets of people. I recreated the raid 3 times and we went up in the boat, 3 times to reenact different parts of the raid, which were extremely informative, right? Really informative. And I know a lot about rice and rice fields. I didn't know a lot about rivers and tides and things like that. So figuring that out was a learning curve for me. And we did a reenactment walking through the rice fields barefoot, right? And completely transformed how I wrote chapter 14. And all of this, participant observation really informed part 3 of the book. And I would go out in the field and do a thing, right? And then I'd go back and rewrite what I wrote the night before. I was also, when I mentioned I hiked, I shouldn't forget that all except one of the 9 plantations that were destroyed in the raid, 7 of them were rice plantations, but there was 9 total. I had access to all except one. So I could contact the owner, sometimes on pretty short notice, and say, "Hey, can I come by? I need to look at X." And they'd say, "Sure, come on over." And sometimes, well, at the research center, I lived at the research center, right? So the scientists who worked there would come in the morning for work, and I was there when they arrived. And I had questions from my writing the night before, and they would say, "Call so and so, we're coming over. Edda's got a question." And we would just jump in the truck and go, right? And when you're in those rice fields, the rice fields are contiguous. So you're going from plantation to plantation to plantation. And each plantation is different, but they're all connected. So just understanding how people communicated, how they traveled, how they shared information, a lot of that was done in the rice fields.
Yeah, that aspect interests me a lot. The networks of communication that enslaved people had with one another. You mentioned that on occasion, say on a Sunday, they might be allowed to leave their plantation area and visit a family member or something, but they must have it must have been very important to them, to their networks of information exchange.
Yeah. And I think that the pension files give us a sense of this and kind of a glimpse into the slave quarters and a glimpse into the enslaved community that we really haven't had before. And so what I saw is people based on gender, so men and then women, who were around the same age. They all went to church together. And I'm talking from different plantations, right? They went to the praise house together. They attended each other's weddings. Sometimes they were an attendant in someone's wedding, and that other person could be as it could be as likely that they were on a different plantation as they were on the same plantation. So these networks extended throughout this lower part of the Combee. Um, I'll never forget this one record. And there's also clearly a hierarchy of age, right? There is a clear that this is how the enslaved community defined itself by age. which I'll say is very West African, probably very African. And so you have the old heads at the top, and then you have, the married folk. And then you have the young people, and I'm not using all of the same names that I used in Combee, but the people who aren't married, they're like teenagers, maybe 20, but they're not married yet, right? And then you have the children. So the Pekin. So just very clear age dynamics and people identifying another person. I grew up under his hand. He's older than me. Sometimes I grew up in his home or he grew up in but he's older than me. He had influence over me. I looked up to him. I'll never forget this one document where this elder, and he's an elder and he's writing for his age mate's, not writing, testifying for his age mate's daughter. Okay. So they're both old heads. And he says, "Oh, yes, I know when her daughter was born. I was right next door in the rice fields. And as soon as I finished my labor, I went to greet the baby." He's across the Combee River. These two plantations face each other on the Combee. Next door? So he finished in the fields and he got in his boat, or he went across the rice fields, right? But information traveled sometimes more easily across the river because of the sound and the acoustics. But he sees himself as next door.
Fascinating. I'm really enjoying these stories behind the scenes of how you did all this research. It must have been extremely exciting to be in the middle of this story and working on location and finding these important documents in the archives. When you talk about all of this, I can start to see how this great historical work emerged from all this.
Thank you.
I want to ask, before we get to the end of our time, I want to ask a couple more questions about Harriet Tubman. I'd like to ask you about how she got the opportunity to start working as a spy, and how the Combahee River Raid operation first was conceived, and how she was chosen to be a part of it.
So after Tubman liberated herself in 1849, she became a part of abolitionist communities. She goes to Philadelphia, and she became a part of abolitionist communities in Philadelphia, Massachusetts, New York, and then, of course, in Canada. And she, had these networks. So it was after the Battle of Port Royal, which took place in November 1861, when the Union Navy took out two forts in Beaufort, and the Union Army came in and they occupied Beaufort, Port Royal, and the Sea Islands. It's after that you had the first social experiment in U.S. history. There were about 8,000 enslaved people who were no longer in bondage. The slaveholders had fled, and the Union Army declared them contrabands of war. So they're not free yet, but the Union would not return this property, in quotes, to the Confederates. So this whole social experiment where you have all these hundreds of abolitionists from the North who come down to South Carolina. And there is a pretty sizable organizing effort in the North within abolitionist communities to mobilize resources and people to go down and help, on this. People had been organizing for the immediate emancipation of slaves for decades, and now 8,000 people were emancipated. So, and they needed a lot of help. So it's part of, Harriet Tubman coming down to Beaufort is a part of this organizing effort in the Port Royal experiment. But unlike the other Northern abolitionists, she doesn't come down as a teacher or a labor manager or a store clerk, um, store owner or a doctor or anything like that. She comes down and her arrangements are made by the governor of Massachusetts to be a spy and a scout for the U.S. Army Department of the South. Yeah. So we still don't know all of the details of that question. However, it seems like it was the brainchild of uh, General David. Why am I blanking on his name? I want to say David Hunter.
Is it
Um,
Montgomery? No,
no,
no.
it seems to me that he shares the idea with Tubman, and Tubman requests Montgomery. Tubman says that she will join if Montgomery is the commander. But it seems like the actual, you know, comes from David Hunter. Now, Tubman is the one who's collecting the intelligence, right? So we should also think about, even if Hunter is the first one to say, I think we should do this, he's saying we should do it based on what Tubman has learned about what's happening on the Combee. And I show in Combee that there were people from these 7 plantations who escaped bondage before the raid and went to Beaufort and worked for the U.S. Army. We know that. Um, and one of them, Friday Barrington, actually joins the 2nd South Carolina, fights in the raid, and goes back and liberates his parents and his sister and his brother-in-law. Um, so we're able to trace that there are people from these 7 plantations. There were many things about how that raid took place that would have required intelligence, in my mind, right? The raid takes place in June. June was the sickly season, which means that it was the season of malaria, and the white people, the enslavers, planters, and the overseers, in a typical year, they all left in early May and came back in late November. So to know that there are going to be no white people on the river, even the Confederate soldiers had been reassigned. Okay. So there's no Confederate soldiers, no boots on the ground on the Combee. To know that several on the other side of the Combee, um, all except one of those plantations had been evacuated. The planters had evacuated. They'd taken their enslaved property with them. On the upper Combee, the planters had evacuated. This is all after the Battle of Port Royal in November 1861. So just on this stretch of Combee are the planters and the enslaved people. Well, are the enslaved people still there? And the planters are continuing to exploit their labor despite the fact that the orders from the Confederate Army to evacuate. So to know that and to target those 7 plantations at this time of year when there is no protection, right? That's intelligence. And so even if Hunter is the one who, said, let's do this, I believe he did that based on the intelligence that Tubman had gathered.
She lived another some 50 years after the Civil War through a remarkable period of American history. How did she live the remainder of her life?
So Tubman continued, to fight for freedom and continued to fight for equality. She was a suffragist and she advocated for women to get the vote. She also she took care of people, right? For her entire life, she took care of people. And she opened her home to people in Auburn, New York, who were poor and destitute and elderly and injured, and took care of these folks and, raised money and just provided for them in many cases, denying her self-care in order to provide for other people. And she purchased her home, and then she had purchased additional land on which she built a home for the elderly and disabled. And so this became an institution that cared for people. And this is where Tubman actually died, at the Harriet Tubman home.
So the last question I'd like to have you talk about, and it's something I like to get every author's take on, is coming up with the title for the book. I'd like you to focus on one particular part. In the title, we have Combee, spelled Combee, and in the subtitle, we have Combahee, at least phonetically, Combahee. Could you talk about those two different spellings? And I'd also like your take on the great cover art of this book and how that picture was chosen, and maybe your take uh, uh, on what it is and what you like about it.
Yeah, that's great questions. So the Combee is the Combee River, and this is how it's pronounced by people of the region. One of the first documents that I found, this is probably the second one, was the second one that made me think that I might have something different to say about the Combee River Raid, was the memoir of a teacher from Boston, um, who came down during the Port Royal experiment. And she, the school was on the refugee camp where the Combee freedom seekers were resettled after the war. So 150 men aged 14 to 70 joined the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers the morning after the war. If you subtract them, that's about 600 women, children, elderly men, and one 70-year-old did enlist and fight for a year and a half, but men who could not enlist, too old to enlist, disabled, incapacitated men, right? So they're all resettled in a refugee camp, and this teacher she opened and she ran the school in this refugee camp. And so I'm tracking people. I'm tracking freedom seekers in Combee. You meet them in part one and learn their backstory. Where do they come from? Then in part three, they escape in the raid. And then in part five, some of them are fighting with the regiment. Some of them are at this refugee camp. So the teacher is naming her students and their families and et cetera, and people who live in this community. And she talks about this elderly woman, old Leah, she calls her. And she talks about how industrious Leah is. She knits while she walks, right? And she spins her own thread and uses it to sew up the soldiers' jackets when their uniforms when they need repair. And so one day she stops her and she asks her, "What are you doing? Where did you learn this?" And the old lady says, "Oh, ma'am, we's Combee. We's Combee," right? And in this refugee camp, there had been waves of people from different sea islands brought in. And then the Combee refugees are brought in. And then the people who were formerly enslaved people who were following General William Tecumseh Sherman in his march through the Carolinas and Georgia, they're brought in. So she's saying, we are from the Combee River, right? And she goes on to say that we didn't have white folks around us most of the year. So we learned how to do things for ourselves. And the teacher remarks as if that says everything. And I'm paraphrasing, but actually it does say everything. So that stuck with me, right? That was one of those documents that I found even before I knew that I was going to write a book about the Combee raid, but I tucked it into my basket and I kept it. So people from the region pronounce the river Combee. It's actually spelled Combahee, and you'll hear all kinds of pronunciations. But people from the area, they call it Combee, and so do I. And I call the river Combee. I call the people Combee. Everything is Combee as far as we are concerned. Y'all can call it what you want. I will say the Combahee Collective. For the Combahee Collective, I will call it Combahee. That's it. Okay. Um, so that had to be the title of the book, right? That had to be the title of the book. There's nothing more authentic than how people call themselves. And these are people who today are part of the Gullah Geechee corridor, who during the Civil War, after they have been liberated from their rice plantations and they're in the South Carolina Sea Islands around all these other folks who today we call Gullah Geechee, and they say, we're Combee. So that was it. So another thing that I had in my basket was William H. Johnson's Freedom Fighters painting of Harriet Tubman. I'm a person who I can be very visual. And if I'm working on a project, to have a visual representation of what I want that project to manifest is important to me. So I had done a survey, of paintings by African American masters, artists depicting Harriet Tubman, and I chose this one. I loved it, and I used it in my lectures as I was writing the book long before I had a publisher. And when I signed my advance contract with Oxford University Press, I said, oh, by the way, this is the cover of the book. And my editor said, oh, don't worry about that. We'll take care of that. We want you to be happy, but that's our job. I thought, okay, if you think I'm going to be happy with something else, good luck. It's a painting of the woodcut of Harriet Tubman during the Civil War, right? So it's a perfect period piece. And it's just so colorful. So I waited, and they were getting ready for the big meeting. Um, and so wanted my input on the cover. Of course, I sent it back to them and the information from the Smithsonian, and I didn't hear anything. I was headed down to Charleston, and in the research that I did, as they asked me to, show the provenance of the painting, I saw, oh, it's on exhibit at the Gibbs Museum of Art. It's part of this Freedom Fighters traveling exhibit from the Smithsonian. I'm going to go see it. And I'm thinking to myself, I've already bought my dress for my book launch. I'm going to go take a picture in my dress with the painting. And I did that. And I texted it to my editor and I said, this is my dress. It matches. He still didn't get it, but they had their meeting and they came up with the right decision. So it all worked out.
It's a great story, and one that I'm glad it ended that way, that it
Me too, because
turned out that
the
way.
dress was, I'd already made a commitment.
Really want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me today and share so many insights from the research and writing parts of doing this book, and taking the time to tell lots of interesting stories from the book as well. I really enjoyed reading the book and enjoyed the conversation today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been great talking with you.